If you want people to trust their leaders, you usually would try and paint them in the best light possible. You don't go out of your way to undermine their authority, but this isn't at all what we see in the Gospels. Those who would eventually lead the church often look impulsive, competent, boastful, and stupid. If the Gospels are supposed to be PR for the apostles, their propaganda team was a dismal failure. This kind of information is what New Testament scholars call the criteria of embarrassment. In his book, Marginal Jew, John Meier writes, "The point of the criterion is that the early church would have hardly gone out of its way to create material that only embarrassed its creator or weakened its position in arguments with opponents." Let's take a look at the Gospel of Mark, since most believe that it's the earliest gospel. Mark tells us that the disciples were often faithless. When encountered by a storm when crossing a lake, the disciples panicked. They brazenly accused Jesus of not caring about them, and Jesus rebuked them for not having any faith. They were also terrified to see Jesus walking on the water only 2 chapters later. When a man brought his demonized son to his followers, the disciples were too incompetent to give the boy any help. Jesus chided them for their lack of faith. Mark also tells us that Jesus' own family thought he was completely nuts. Later we read in Acts, 1 Corinthians, and Galatians that James and Jesus' other siblings became leaders in the church. So far, the future heads of Jesus' church look like a pretty sorry bunch. Mark also tells us that the disciples were extremely slow on the uptake. They asked questions about Jesus' parables that he expected them of all people to understand. His main points were often lost on them. Jesus previously fed a crowd of 5,000 and then later 4,000 with a few loaves and fish. Shortly afterward, Jesus said that they should beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. What did the disciples do in response? They fussed with each other because they forgot to pack bread for their journey. Jesus had to remind them that food was neither his point nor an issue, and that should have been obvious to them by then. The disciples were notoriously bad-mannered. As I mentioned earlier, they accused Jesus of not caring about them when he was sleeping during the storm. Peter had the genius idea of rebuking Jesus when he said that he was going to sacrifice himself. Jesus called Peter Satan in response, so yeah, that didn't go over really big. When people brought small children to Jesus to be blessed by him, like ogres, his disciples tried to run them off. And when the woman anointed Jesus' feet with costly perfume, Mark tells us that they rebuked her harshly. Not a real smooth move. Jesus emphatically told them to leave her alone. She obviously had more value for Jesus than all of them put together. The disciples fought over who was the greatest, and James and John had the brass to ask Jesus if they could sit at his right and left hand when he came into his kingdom. They clearly didn't understand the kind of servant leadership that Jesus was modeling. In Jesus' darkest hour, they bragged about being willing to die before abandoning him. While Jesus was praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, they all fell asleep. Peter ended up denying him 3 times when pressed by a servant girl, and all of the disciples were AWOL on the day of the resurrection, even though Jesus repeatedly told them he'd rise again 3 days later. Even atheist scholars like Gerd Ludemann use the criteria of embarrassment when arguing for the historicity of Peter's denial. Finally, who was it that actually showed up to Jesus' tomb? It was the women. They were the first eyewitnesses to the empty tomb, and this by itself is a very embarrassing detail, as a woman's testimony in the first century context carried very little weight. To give just a couple of examples, Josephus writes, "But let not the testimony of women be admitted on the account of their levity and boldness of their sex." And in the Talmud we read, "Any evidence which a woman gives is not valid to offer." Luke tells us that the disciples thought that the women's testimony was nonsense. They didn't even believe them. And 100 years later, the skeptic Celsus would mock Christians for believing the tales of a hysterical woman. Again, if this is something that is supposed to be Christian propaganda to make their leaders look good or make the resurrection story look more plausible, the gospel writers cause problems for themselves. In the words of New Testament scholar N.T. Wright, "As historians, we are obliged to comment that if these stories had been made up 5 years later, let alone 30, 40, or 50 years later, they would have never had Mary Magdalene in this role. To put Mary there from the point of view of Christian apologists wanting to explain to a skeptical audience that Jesus really did rise from the dead is like shooting themselves in the foot. But to us as historians, this kind of thing is gold dust. The early Christians would never make this up. And it's not like things are all hunky-dory in the book of Acts either. You know, the book about the apostles taking over after Jesus. You think Luke would make them look like they finally got their act together. Instead, we see Paul and Barnabas getting into a big tiff over bringing Mark, the future gospel writer, along on their journey because Mark got homesick and left them in the middle of ministry time. Mark is later mentioned in Paul's letters, so apparently things got patched up later. We also see in Acts that there was racist bickering going on in the infant church in Jerusalem because the Hellenized Jewish widows were being neglected in the daily distribution of food. And even though Jesus Jesus told him to take the gospel to the entire world, it took a special vision for Peter to finally understand that it was okay to preach to those dirty Gentiles years later. Luke and Mark hardly make the apostles look out to be super saints. Now compare this to other Christian propaganda. Eusebius wrote a biography of the Emperor Constantine that was very charitable, to say the least. He slyly omits that Constantine had his own son Crispus and his other wife Fausta killed. Eusebius instead makes Constantine out to be some great saint. Now, that is what real propaganda looks like. It's hard to imagine the early Christians inventing embarrassments for themselves when they had enough problems dealing with persecution, and yet it is very difficult to read the Gospel of Mark without getting a negative impression of the apostles. Again, this is the earliest of the Gospels according to most scholars. Eyewitnesses would still be around, including some of the apostles. These negative statements are strong indicators that these things were really said. New Testament scholar C.E.B. Cranfield concludes, "The fact that the perplexing and offensive material was preserved at all and reached Mark says much about the general reliability of the sources used by him. These self-damaging materials are one more reason why we can trust the Gospels. This kind of evidence doesn't by itself prove that the Gospels are reliable, but it does lend support in that direction. It's one part of a much larger cumulative case. For that, please check out my playlist on the trustworthiness of the Gospels, and be sure to hit subscribe as I have plans to do many more videos on this topic in the future." Thanks for watching.